And if y'all recall, I did mainland China and Taiwan, which was frozen since 1949.
My name is Erika Reynolds, and I am analyzing the conflict between First Nations and Indigenous peoples in Canada and the Canadian government / the Crown.
Okay, and my name is Janae Robertson, and the conflict that I chose to do was fragile peace in South Sudan.
Ooh, who wants to go first?
I can go first, yeah. Let me pull up the list so I can go in order. A continuation from the environmental challenges number 4 that I can talk about South Sudan is the security is still an issue. Friday, I was watching the news actually, and the U.S. Needs to evacuate South Sudan because Sudan rather, because there is still violence in Sudan, even though there was a ceasefire. So yeah, so that's happening. So
I just saw that on the news as I walked by the TV. I was like, oh dear.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, so that's the only new thing that I found so far about environmental challenges. And on the topic of security in incorporating the USIP improving peacebuilding evaluation, a scale problem can be a relation as well to South Sudan. And in the article, a scale problem is basically only focusing on one aspect of a conflict instead of the multiple ones that make up the conflict. And so in security, or in terms of security, the focus that I talked about in my paper that I mainly saw about South Sudan is how the government or the government's relationship with security, and the focus should be on the people as well and how they're feeling, and the refugees, and right now with this evacuation as well. Another connection I made with the same article is the accountability chain. And basically, each organization is on different levels as far as a need to know basis. So with the accountability chain, the accountability they're talking about is discussing both the good and the bad of, for instance, a workshop on whether it was successful or not in de-escalating the conflict, and how they mainly focus on the good of the peace building rather than what didn't work and what did work. They only know about, well, what they should do is keeping everyone informed from on these workshops, so to speak, in this progression, because it is changing their country in significant ways. So it's important to have everyone from the people to the government on the same page. And the other article that I chose is the measuring conflict evaluations, I believe was the name of it. And one that mainly stuck out to me was the criminalization of national security forces and the exploitation of natural resources. I think between South Sudan and Sudan itself that there is definitely an exploitation, being that Sudan has more access to resources than South Sudan does. And segueing into that, I chose to do the ICAF framework, and mainly step 2 about the core grievances and the social and institutional resistance. So with core grievance, the government, so the main root causes of the fragile peace in South Sudan is tribalism, the control of food, and the motivation of fear and uncertainty. So with the core grievance, the government has access to the food or to food and who they distribute it to. So and as far as social resilience, the women that are now in parliament in South Sudan, making decisions for policies that at first did not concern them is a form of resilience because change is being made there. And the third or the second step of the ICAF is social patterns and changing to less blame of Sudan's president promotes peaceful resolution by moving forward and being less interdependent of the country Sudan itself. So that's a change that's being made as well. And the last step, or the last section rather of that step, are the threatened identity groups. And the list that I made was the poor that were there before and the poor that are there now because of all the civil wars that occurred. And another one was women and how they didn't have a say so in things that concern them, but now they do. That's it.
I had a
Another was a
question.
lot. Yes.
When you were talking about the Sudanese government withholding food. So the Sudanese government also rules over South Sudan, right?
Right.
So there were food supplies or reserves that were supposed to be distributed to the people, but then you had, you know how you had those mercenary groups that come in, like
Right.
they stopped like the transport of the food supplies and took it over so they could feed their own troops. I wonder, do you think that could be something that's coming into play, or is it just the government saying we're just not going to give y'all food? Because that's something that has played out before.
Yeah. I think now, before, I think it was the government saying, no, we're just not going to do that because y'all left us or whatever. But now I think the missionaries being more helpful in that way is what is occurring now.
Okay. So I just wonder how much is it? I know there have been issues before in other countries in Africa, and some of it was due to the mercenaries or those shadow governments that we talked about in whatever other class it was, that developed as a result of conflict. You had those shadow governments, and then you have essentially the bad guys that kind of join forces with the government, and they create this whole other alternative economy is what I would call it. So there's like people doing whatever they can to survive. Meanwhile, the mercenary groups, these militant mercenary, whoever they are, have control because the government's giving them control because they're not as strong or organized as they were pre-conflict. You know what I mean?
Well, thanks for your presentation, Janae. That was pretty informative, and thank you. Did you want to go next, Erika, or shall I?
Well, I guess I'll go ahead.
Okay.
So let me go back to environmental. I believe I touched on this before. So in Canada, the Canadian government allows corporations like Nestle to come in, and the Six Nations territory, specifically, Nestle has set up a water bottling plant in in the river or around the rivers right above Six Nations so that it stops their water supply or curtails their water supply, and they bottle the water there. So the Six Nations territory, those reserves do not have clean potable water. So they actually have to leave the reservations, the reserves, to go and get water. So their children are not able to bathe. They can't, cooking is limited because you know, without water, you can't cook. And they have developed lots of different skin conditions, other health issues. Of course, if you can't take showers and you can't eat, then you can't bathe. I mean, it's just, you're not washing your dishes. You've got to load laundry up and you know, go off reserve to go find places to have laundry. But then the waste from those bottling plants filters down in those rivers. So anybody that comes in contact with that water then gets sick. So these territories are under a boil advisory and have been so for the past 20 to 30 years. That's one of the big economic issues, or economic and ecological issues, that affects the First Nations. So the United Nations, with the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, came up with some guidelines in conjunction with Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Canada, the Canadian government, adopted, I want to say 6 or 7 of the 20 odd recommendations that they were in agreement with, that they would adopt. One of those was to protect traditional food supplies and water. So Canada actually enacted legislation to dedicate resources to clean up the water and making sure that all reserves had access to clean potable water. They enacted the legislation, and then within, I'm going to say, a month or so, not long enough to do anything, they came back and repealed it. So they're not in agreement or complying with those regulations and guidelines. And this was something that they had worked with to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission specifically to help resolve the conflict between First Nations and the government. So I thought that was interesting. And then with racial and gender equity, I think I mentioned it in the beginning in the other video, we have the missing, murdered, and Indigenous women and girls epidemic in Canada. So Indigenous women are more likely than any other ethnic group to go missing, to be victims of domestic violence or murder or a sexual assault. And those incidences they're not tracked and they're not investigated like they should. And most times, even if they are reported, they're not, you don't never see them on the news. I also chose to use the ICAF guidelines for the analysis framework. So of course, the key actors are the First Nations, Indigenous people, and the Canadian government. So that includes federal, provincial, and territorial governments. So for First Nations people, the recognition of sovereignty is one of their major interests, rights to self-determination, control their land and resources, education, and seek reconciliation for harms caused by colonialism, like Indian residential schools and assimilation. So Canadian government's interests are, promoting, of course, economic development, protection, national security, and law and order. So the Canadian government says they are committed to reconciling. However, it's not quite evident. Yeah, so it's like, are you really doing that? Some of the context, it all dates back to settler colonialism, the Indian Act of 1876. So that in Canada, that contributes to marginalization and oppression. Part of that was the residential school system and forced assimilation. And in fact, and I think I might have touched on this before, if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she was then classified as non-Indigenous. If an Indigenous man married a non-Indigenous woman, then their children would be half Indigenous, And if they were under treaty, if that man was under a treaty, his band was under a treaty, then the kids would be able to receive some of the benefits of that treaty, but not all. And if they married, if those children married someone else who was non-Indigenous, their children would not receive any of those benefits. And they would no longer be classified as Indigenous. So that's part of that legislation, and that still exists now. The tensions are still there. There have been protests, the I Don't Know More movement, blockades, legal challenges. So some of the Indigenous tribes have, presented legal challenges in the courts. And then the Canadian government has responded with force, more police, police actions, elevated arrests, which, all leads to further strain. And it's just a cycle that keeps repeating itself. So one of the things that could help to move resolution or transformation of the conflict would be true commitment on the part of the government to work with Indigenous tribes to implement those guidelines that the UN and UNDRIP, or UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, help to establish. And that would include land claims, of course, access to clean potable water resources, protection of Indigenous language and culture, recognizing the contributions Indigenous people have had across the country, and then just basically reconciliation and reparation, apologize for some of the harms that have been caused, like that actual true commitment. And when you enact legislation, don't go back in 30 days and repeal it, of course. Also, with looking at the DAC guidelines, one thing I want to say is, like, this could help, track peace building efforts with strategic planning, making a strategic plan with viable steps, and making sure that these are clear targets that the government and the tribes are able to hit or meet with specific objectives, so that you can measure progress. And then focus on, like, land claims, resource development, helping to regenerate languages, protect Indigenous rights, understanding what are those rights, what do they look like, and are these rights as they are seen by Indigenous people, or is this rights as seen by the government? Then address the socioeconomic issues. We have a lot of poverty, a lot of, and there's unequal education, and it reminds me of Brown versus Board of Education, that separate but equal doctrine. And then build partnerships. Make sure that, if there's government monies or programs that are focused on, like, entrepreneurship, build also a partnership with Indigenous people so that they're able to become a stakeholder in their own destiny, and give them those opportunities that are found in bigger, more incorporated locations. Collaborate with Indigenous people, and then just have something that's able to monitor these steps along the way, and then go back and be able to reflect and revamp as we're moving along. So the guidelines for the DAC guidelines would be great for measuring the progress of peace building and then that transformation. But it has to be a true commitment, especially on the part of the Canadian government, that is yet to be seen. So that's it.
Awesome. I was thinking about before African Americans were given the right to vote, and it was very similar to what you're describing in Canada with the Indigenous tribes, as far as their rights being stripped away or granted according to, their ethnic lineage. So that just kind of sounded familiar.
Yeah. If you look at it, when you look at this conflict with First Nations and then the African American community, they pretty much mirror each other. What happened in the African American community was, even though people were stripped of when you brought Africans over here for slavery purposes, you separated families and ethnic groups and language groups, but there was a commonality of they were all made slaves. Thing with indigenous people is like you find reserves, so they're further apart. So any mobilization or efforts to come together, you know, before there was internet and cell phones and all that good stuff, I mean, it was hard. And like if you're in an economically depressed place and it's hard to get together, and that's the one thing that the civil rights movement had, it was you had people all together in the same place basically, and they were like, hey, we're joining forces, we're going to do this, and they had support of other groups as well. So because we're talking about First Nations in Canada, I'll say this about Standing Rock here in the United States. That was something that mobilized people around the entire world and came together. So that was, you know, a little bit like what happened during the civil rights movement. But yeah, it is similar because it's the same thing happening all over again. That's a great observation.
Thank you. Yeah. Did you have any questions for Erika, you think, Janae?
Statements more. I think it's interesting, like as you were talking, a thought that came to mind was it's interesting how the people seem to know what to do in regards to themselves in comparison to the government not knowing much of anything. Like when you said, and another interesting thing you said too was how like the government, like they said that they will was it reconcile? They're reconciled, but then when something happens, they like push back with like all the guns and all the violence. So I think that's interesting about him, about how they don't really want change in that sense.
Yeah, it's
And
like,
I think that comes because it influences economic development. So those corporate interests fuel money back to the government. So if it involves money, they're going to be like, wait a minute now. So, yeah.
okay, cool. All right, well, I guess I'll go on to mine. And if y'all recall, I did mainland China and Taiwan, which was frozen since 1949. As I touched upon in the first group roundtable, tensions between mainland China and Taiwan have been described as frozen. But through the support of a third-party actor, the U.S. support of Taiwan through provisions and weapons, the main environmental concern that emerges is that of the security dilemma, which I briefly touched upon. And that's a major factor in global climate change. Anyway, the United States military is a leading contributor to the climate crisis, as the USA spends over 50% of its discretionary budget every year on defense, while China is also a major contributor to climate change. These two nations with the largest economies would be better to take the lead as far as mitigating the climate crisis instead of exacerbating it. As for gender and racial equity, I feel that in this case of what could be called an interstate conflict, or you could say it's perceived as intrastate from a Chinese perspective, because they see it as a civil conflict. Gender and racial equity may not factor into the analysis as much as it does in some others, such as Erika's and Janae's presentations. Certainly, Taiwan has a woman in its highest leadership position with President Tsai, which I seriously doubt we'll see in mainland China for a while to come, but also chose the ICAF. Beginning with an evaluation of the context of the conflict, understanding core grievances and social institutional resilience, and identifications of the drivers and mitigating factors, which I mentioned in our first roundtable video. As for the fourth step in an ICAF conflict diagnosis, describing opportunities to increase or decrease the conflict, seems that dialogue and diplomacy may be the only peaceful way forward, other than maintaining the very tense status quo of frozenness and continuing increasing of arms. However, China has indicated recently that it's ready to fight and smash Taiwanese independence. I think that was April 10th or so, while it
Mhm.
conducted military drills around Taiwan. So China's not backing down on its claims to Taiwan anytime soon, it seems. But as for the DAC guidelines and other analytical tools, they seem to be geared towards intrastate conflicts and not as ready applicable to the mainland China frozen conflict. But however, looking at the measuring progress in conflict environments, the most relevant applications to China, Taiwan seem to be found in asking economic type questions, such as, are there economic incentives to continue the conflict? I would say yes. Weapon sales. Do government officials profit from continued conflict? Yes. Weapon sales and semiconductor sales and other things. Do government officials profit from the control of trade and commercial goods? Again, semiconductors are an example. Taiwan makes, I think it was 60% of the world's semiconductors. Those are little chips that go into things. So, yeah, the United States is really reliant on Taiwan for semiconductors. Anyway, another question that we could ask is, do foreign governments support warring factions financially or materially? The United States supports Taiwan. What is the dollar value of arms transferred to the target country by foreign governments? These are things we could measure as far as measuring progress in conflict environments. What is the extent of control of resources by forces belonging to or supported by foreign governments? Like, who controls those weapons and the semiconductors? What goods, items are being exported by neighboring countries? So there's a lot of questions and things you can ask and answer related to the USIP MPICE. So in conclusion, some portions of the MPICE are directly applicable to mainland China Taiwan conflict, while others are less so. And the ones I didn't mention are less so. So I think that's about all I was going to say. Thank you.
I was wondering, the one thing I was thinking about, like you mentioned that Taiwan manufactures like 60% of the semiconductors. Like, that's a lot. That's
Yeah.
a lot of semiconductors. And I just think about, like, wouldn't the US be benefit better economic wise if we manufacture some of that here in-house in the United States, like to
They'd be much more
manufacture
expensive to produce.
Yeah.
Much more
Yeah.
expensive.
Yeah. So, in taking those semiconductors or chips or whatever that are manufactured, and can we rework those? Is it something that,
Can be
because I know
solved.
is it something that we can work on to that it affects the environment because we're not doing the best we could? I guess I don't necessarily understand the philosophy behind why China has to have Taiwan. Like I get it, economically we want it, but like, why can't they just be themselves?
Well, that's the whole point of the frozenness of the conflict. It was actually a civil war. You know, China is rivaling the US now as far as economies, and you know, as far as needing Taiwan, I doubt they do, but as far as strategically, it would be they claim that it would open up the Pacific to, this is US defense people claim that it would open up the Pacific to China.
Yeah.
To
Okay.
be offensive about. But yeah, it's a major rivalry, and where everybody's arming themselves to the teeth, and they have been for years. I mean, China more so now, but like America has sold more weapons in the past years to you know, different countries than ever before. So it's like it's proliferating all over. Just
Yeah, it's It's interesting. When I listen to you all talk about your conflicts, I have all these things run through my mind like, wow.
Cool.
What does this mean? Like overall and in general, how are we gonna survive this? Hopefully.
If China decided to invade Taiwan and then the United States responded, other than Taiwan responding, which we provided them weapons, and the porcupine strategy where they like, I mean, that's why it's like the frozenness is the status quo of the conflict.
I can tell you my major takeaway is this power imbalance that are between the conflicting parties. Like it seems like there's this huge power imbalance between one and the other, like the haves and have-nots. And that is something that's a bit disheartening. Culturally speaking, as an Indigenous woman, balance is huge in Native American culture. What I do affects everyone else. So
just such a huge difference between the haves and have-nots, as you said, and the ones who have power. You know, they have the power and they get to say what goes down.
Yeah, I mean, this is the one thing I think about with the conflict between First Nations and the government. If you really just honored the treaties, if you really did what you said you were going to do, like, why is it okay to continually deprive one group of people of that with empty promises? Oh, we're going to work on it, and then you don't do it, and then if your response to protest or, legal challenges is to send in more law enforcement or whatever. But also the whole point, you look at the policies against First Nations, Indigenous people, they're genocidal policies, forced assimilation, forced loss of language and culture, forced onto desolate, isolated places where you don't have adequate access to water or food supply things. And I think that, like, even with the Sudanese that you were talking about, Janae, I think that kind of plays into that conflict as well with, restricting the food. Like, people have to eat.
Thanks, Erika. That was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
I guess, riffing off of you, Erika, all the conflicts show an imbalance of power, like you're saying, and the balance of power is kind of skewed by a third party coming in, United States, and kind of messing with the whole scenario. I guess that we need to make peace out of conflict. That's my takeaway. Sorry.
It makes sense, though. I think that makes sense.
Good.
Yeah, and my takeaway, I just popped in my head. Now I was going to say something else, but I'll say this: is to have the government, which may not never happen, is to be more compassionate, just with everything, really. Like, just basically be more involved and more upfront, and just holding that accountability with people, but with that the root of that is being more compassionate. Because in a lot of the conflicts you see, that they don't really care. So maybe, if you slightly cared a little bit, just a little bit, just to see what happens, then
maybe pretend a little bit.
Right. Yeah. Right. At least pretend. So, so just being compassionate in that way, because they have the power, doesn't mean you have to be separated from everybody else. If that makes sense.
Right. But good takeaway.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have to agree. If just care a little bit, just
Right.
Yeah,
Just a
please.
teaspoon. A teaspoon of caring. Throw it in there.